Good morning. Particularly, of course, Mr. Mohammed Almoghayer. We're very happy to see you here present at this ceremony. Also welcome the audience, and I would like to ask you to please switch off your mobile phone so that we won't be disturbed during the ceremony. I declare the meeting open. I bid you, Mr. Mohammed Almoghayer, most heartily welcome. You may now give a brief exposition of your research, of your reasons for having undertaken it, and of the results it has yielded.
Good morning, Mr. Rector Magnificence, members of the examining committee, ladies and gentlemen. As the scholarship is starting to show, media production in factional and post-conflict societies like Palestine can become another weapon in the battles for hearts and minds that continues to wage a kind of war once weapons are put down. My study examines exactly the opposite. How a kind of factional divisionism in media can be avoided. Children's and cultural programs, Al-Aqsa satellite channel, associated with Hamas, were compared with the children and cultural programs of the Palestine satellite channel associated with Fatah. Each is a faction of the Palestinian national movement. The study interrogates how factors beyond factional politics impact on content and production of culture and children programs on both TV channels ASC and PSC. Since the First and Second Intifada and the Oslo Accords, has satellite TV helped to move factions or Hamas and PLO or the Palestinian Authority media beyond narrow factionalism? The study looks for evidence of moving beyond factionalism, in other words, for defactionalizing of content. The selected study period is March 2009 to January 2010 for the 4 selected programs: Sesame Street and Pioneers of Tomorrow, children's programs and culture shows, and Burning Brands, the 2 cultural programs of PSC and ASC, respectively. During the study period, changes in the audience, reach, and production techniques, new modes of Israeli occupation, and re-emergent discourses of Palestinianism all impacted children's and cultural programming. This study shows that in the 2009-2010 period, Palestinian media producers were trying to overcome factional divisions in terms of content and production values. Both children and culture programs were moving beyond the narrow factionalism associated in the earlier period with both ASC and PSC channels. The study proceeds by contextualizing the historical and wider social context of the political struggle between Hamas and Fatah, so that satellite TV content and production processes can be better understood. Examining and analyzing thematic content through both a quantitative and qualitative analysis of total of 88 episodes of children and cultural programs and some dozen interviews in relation to the 2 TV stations along factional lines. Theorizing what is meant to move beyond factionalism media production and identifying new forms of emergent Palestinianism, how producers negotiate the circuits of media and managing programming so to avoid factionalism is of a great interest. It is important to define defactionalization, especially for the academics and others interested in the Middle East media. For content analysis in this study, I watched 88 episodes of 4 programs. With inputs from the Palestinian field supervisors, I then coded the content and discussed it in details with themes were present and which were absent. I then analyzed the data using mixed methodologies with both quantitative and qualitative elements. The content analysis was combined with a mixed method approach that made it possible to explore discourses of producers related to various stages of the media production process as well. This widened the range of possible factional and defactionalized patterns that could potentially be identified. There are 2 main questions. One, I look at the political, social, and other contextual factors influencing the day-to-day decisions of the producers of the programs involved and how they communicate in a factional or defactionalized way. The other one is how the local, regional, and global context and how do they affect the content of production for the 4 programs in relation to the selected themes. 9 themes have been selected in this study, and mostly they are nationalism, citizens' rights, resistance, social, religious, cultural, political, and educational values, as well as entertainment. The themes were selected for several reasons. I will mention 3 of them. First, initial viewing of 88 episodes of the TV programs clarified that all these themes either occurred frequently or were notably and sometimes surprisingly absent. Second, because several themes of enhancing democratic communications in Palestine can be related to the idea of children's and cultural programs as expressing something akin to democratization of Palestinian media. Citizens' rights were included as a proxy for the democratization given the context of overall Israeli occupation. Third, some of the themes represent a significant gap in current media research. For example, as a prominent Palestinian scholar, Thawabta suggested in 2010 a study where the themes of politics of resistance in particular needs to be better understood in relation to the production and content of media in Palestine. Now, coming to the main findings of my research. A first set of findings is about the move beyond factionalism. The concept of defactionalized media content is an important one to the Palestinian context as it brings in voices that speaks to common concerns and by which contrasting solutions for the problem faced can be more openly debated without automatic resort of rhetorical ordering and other forms of factionalized media discourse. This has produced a new form of Palestinianism which emerged in the media after 2010. I found that when the media content was analyzed, it became clear it was greatly influenced by the diversity of perspectives from minority groups. This includes women, minorities, and intellectuals and artists. These diverse and varied voices influence content-mediated competition between PSC and ASC and diversified values considered appropriate for culture and children programs. All this reinforced moves towards defactionalizing program content by producers. So instead of ASC keeping a monopoly on discussions about culture within a narrow group of individuals closely affiliated to Hamas political chief, defactionalization has taken place. The same is true of children programs and for the ASC and PSC alike. Second, I found 4 main reasons for moves beyond factionalism and towards defactionalization. 1, the pressure of market force on both PSC and ASC. 2, the more relaxed political climate among Palestinian political factions. 3, the dark side of satellite technology with its risks as well as potentials. Third, I found that new forms of Palestinianism emerging in the media. Overall, in this study, I tend to agree to a larger extent with the overarching theoretical work of Duzay and others on media life is relevant. From this perspective, media is omnipresent and people no longer only live with media content, they also live within media context. That means people use the media as a part of context of their daily life. This research takes the argument one step further, suggesting that media can be means for Palestinian people to break through some of the restrictions imposed on their daily life by the occupation, and sometimes some of the restrictions imposed by inter-party factionalism as well. For a paradox, the role of security apparatuses in shaping content. And lastly, by providing a lasting common enemy, the persistence of the Israeli military occupation has contributed to the emergence of the new and more diverse form of media content in Palestinian satellite TV, and a more global audience based that was not possible in the past. As was often noted in interviews with producers, Palestinian satellite TV stations will probably continue to multiply in the future as means of assessing Palestinian cultural identity and rights, and as a form of virtual Palestinianism. There are 4 puzzles of media in Palestinian that emerge as a result of this study. Limited financial resources can promote self-censorship, that's number 1, where resources restrictions constrains producers and the quality of programs alike. Budgets do not always allow for out-of-studio filming, so that media has always been forthcoming enough in giving a platform for people's voices. 2, loyalty and self-censorship. Those who work in the media are often reluctant to express or voice significant opposition to the PA or Hamas. One obvious reason for the Palestinian media restraint is that there is self-censorship based on the idea of being loyal to Hamas or the Palestinian Authority. After all, Hamas and the Palestinian Authority can, for example, control access to finances. Importantly, the third puzzle relates to the conflicting pressure on private media outlets in Palestine. 3, the possible paradox of factional appeal. According to Haroub and Kones, more factionalized media content may be rewarded with larger audience and more financial support. Yet, looking at historical precedents and after conducting further research, it may emerge that factionalism is the media cannot be equated with the existence or proliferation of Palestinian factions in politics. 4, Gazan exceptionality. Not one of the 32 privately owned TV stations that broadcast and not one of the 3 major newspapers presently distributed in Gaza is able to produce their content from within Gaza itself. The fact alone begs for an explanation. When compared with the West Bank, the obvious answer is that this is because of the Israeli occupation and the restrictions this brings about on the movement of goods and services. I hope that further research will look into this again and that the field can be looked both sides and outside the Gaza, for instance, through teams and researchers working together in the West Bank, Gaza, and Jerusalem. And now I will conclude. The media has long been an important part of the infrastructure of modern Palestinian life. Satellite TV is now a distinctly Palestinian cultural institution, capable of expressing resistance to occupation and a great deal more besides. Even amidst the highest polarized political environments of 2009-2010, within the Palestinian territories, ASC and PSC, as a producer of culture and the children programming, have contributed to a renewed sense of a shared identity among Palestinian people across different segregated territories. Thus, a new sense of Palestinianism was found to be emerging in the media, with the slight variations in the kind of Palestinianism between ASC and PSC. This is despite in the fact that the producers in a channel operate within a system that is still highly factional and polarized politically. Arab ministers of information recently declared that the forms of media can become a kind of offshore democracy in the Arab world. Defactionalizing media works well in this regard. My research has exposed through this specific example of children's and cultural programs how television networks can help reduce rather than reinforce factionalism and enable the voiceless to have a say. What this suggests also is that Palestinian media should be supported as a channel for peace building in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Candidate, particularly for your presentation. And we will now turn to the examiners. I call upon the first external examiner, Professor Beverly Milton Edwards of Queen's University Belfast, to start the exchange of ideas.
Thank you. Dear candidate, let me commence by firstly commending and congratulating you on your PhD and research contained within the thesis, and the clear evidence throughout that thesis of sustained scholarship in difficult circumstances in the field. For indeed, this is a field in the Palestinian territories which is increasingly dangerous, especially for independent academic scholarship. And this requires, as you have shown, courage for those under the double burden of undertaking research under occupation and increasingly authoritarian rule by the local governing powers. Well done. Dear candidate, I would like to please firstly discuss with you how it can truly be the case, as one of the main voices in your PhD, the ASC head Salah al-Bardawil claims, and as you state is largely justified, that children's TV particularly, and on ASC, is defactional, when in fact it presents only one mediated dimension of Palestinianism, that in fact absents plurality and substitutes not Islam, but Islamism instead. This is what I would like to discuss with you.
Highly learned opponent. Thank you so much for this good question. Regarding this issue of how ASC present this as a defactionalized, as we all know that the ASC is an Islamic rhetoric, an Islamic-oriented TV station, which has its own narrative, but there was before some contrast with previous children programs. For example, some of the episodes that I have seen where, for instance, George W. Bush Muppet have been slaughtered in the show, which was criticized and create a lot of problems in the United States, as well as copyrights for using some of these Muppets that were used previously in the United States. So I would say that yes, I do accept the argument of Dr. Bardawil when he said that it is defactionalized, when he meant that there is no naming and shaming, but there is only one direction, and that's to liberate the Palestinian cause, to liberate the Palestinians, and to work towards a shared identity. For instance, what comes out through these interviews and also during the content analysis of programs, we've seen that there is only what unites Palestinians. There is the talk about prisoners, there is the talk about Jerusalem, there is the talk about the right of return, there is the talk about the love for land, there is the talk about the respect for parents, social values, educational values. All these things are really common, whether Islamist or not Islamist, they have been quite common, as he argued. And I have taken this argument quite seriously, and I challenged my interviewees in different ways by watching these TVs and going back, even giving them the result of what I found. So I would say that defactionalization did indeed occur, but under the umbrella of looking for some form of balance to represent a side of the Islamic defactionalized content in order for them to meet in the middle of the way with the PSC, where it's more of a national media discourse.
Okay, you want to follow up?
Just one brief follow-up, in particular in relation to a tension that I believe exists when we have significant Hamas leaders like Salah al-Bardawil claiming and making claims to you about a less factional climate, when in fact figures like him are a significant conduit for statement and constant restatement during the period of study and after the period of study for factional hostility, and in particular against his nationalist and other partners in the attempt to end the state of divide. How is that tension reconciled?
This tension, in my argument, was actually reconciled in the children and program talks. And as we have seen in this study, he said something which I quite remember. He said, the bones of factionalism did not hit the children programs and culture programs, because that's the only thing that is left which is going to unite us. If we don't unite there, then there will be never unification. There has been no defactionalization in the news production, for example, in the debate until today. In fact, until yesterday, where I watched one of the shows, there hasn't been any form of defactionalization. So your argument is right, but for the Palestinian children and cultural shows, no, I stand with the argument that defactionalization did indeed occur. Both Hamas and Fatah showed the willingness to compromise on content and production in order to overcome defactionalization. Is that going to be continuing for other non-children and non-entertainment or non-culture programs? I don't know.
Okay, you're satisfied with the response? Okay, thank you. Then we turn to the second external examiner, Professor Naomi Sacker from the University of Westminster, to continue the exchange of ideas.
Dear candidate, I'd like to endorse and follow up on what my colleague, Professor Milton Edwards said in congratulating you on completing this research. And I recognize, like her, how arduous it has been on all levels. I can't say that strongly enough. Researching media in the Middle East is always a very ambitious undertaking, and I think people don't always realize how ambitious, because your informants are always worried about sharing their real thoughts on almost any topic. Getting access to people can be extremely difficult because people don't want to go on record saying anything that can be held against them. Background information is unreliable, and authoritarian systems in the region, both in politics and business and other circles, are maintained by dint of censorship and self-censorship, a lack of honesty, lack of transparency, and so on. But then, on top of that, you've researched media production, which in any context is problematic, because you're trying to get to decisions that are usually made in private, decisions that may be made for devious political or commercial reasons. And when you put the two contexts together and you have respondents who are often not used to social science research methods, you've given yourself a real set of obstacles to overcome. So well done for achieving this output. And I should also say that I admire your account of your fieldwork practicalities that is now included in the thesis, and the details in particular of conducting your interviews. And I urge you really to write a journal article on this, on the methodological issues you faced. For example, the need for patronage, which comes across very strongly in terms of, you need intermediaries, the guardedness of your interviewees, the logistical issues, and so on. And not to mention the difficulty in the circumstances of avoiding leading questions. So my question has to do with the focus in your conclusion on ethics. So you talk about journalistic ethics, and I accept that the media practitioners that you have interviewed can, of course, they can be considered journalists, because they're not doing news, but they're, they're producing cultural programs and children's programs. I would like you to explain how your policy recommendations about ethics relate to the findings of your research. And I stress that I do not just mean the findings as such, but your explanation and interpretation of the findings. Because, as we know from your presentation just now, the focus of your findings is on Palestinianism, which is explanation, interpretive work. But then your conclusion moves into this kind of normative mode and stance. And I'd like to know, how do you reconcile these two approaches, the interpretive and the normative? What has Palestinianism got to do with journalistic ethics as understood internationally?
Highly learned opponent, thank you so much for this most useful question, which I indeed face in my, especially in the last year of doing this research. There is one problem that we have to acknowledge in the Palestinian context, that there is no real difference between media workers, those who are producing the programs, and journalists. So they are all falling under one umbrella, and that's the journalist syndicate. So just to make this clear and to set the record right. Having said this, I do see your argument. It's quite valid. There were some issues related to defactionalization where the intention of me in looking at the issue of ethics or code of ethics is to reinforce all the guidelines which offers a legal umbrella, in fact, to the journalists and to the media workers to operate also in culture and TV programs. Having said this, Palestinianism is about reunification. Palestinianism is about lack of factional content, and that's exactly what the code of ethics is all about, really. It's about looking at for what unites the Palestinians and what does not bring in some arguments or some issues that may hit the Palestinian unity or the Palestinian agenda. So I do see that similarity. We are talking in one hand about the Palestinianism, where it's talked about shared identity, and there is also the code of ethics, which is exactly, at the end, for me, they meet, if I can say so. They meet in a sense that in order for the journalists and the media producers, they have to be honest, they have to be balanced in the reporting, and they have to be fair. For instance, when there is somebody calling on ASC program with a children's show and suddenly starts to endorse the understanding of Islamic thinking, then he will be kept on the show. The same like of Palestine satellite TV, if somebody is calling from abroad, which happened during the show. That's an example that I draw on. We have seen it. So the journalists could as well just shut this conversation and say, we don't want to listen to this and we want to move on. But that's exactly the opposite of what the Palestinian code of conduct is saying. So to offer up a code of conduct, which is also a very big problem given the division between Hamas and Fatah. Now we have, or the Palestinians have many more bodies for journalists. There is the official syndicate, there is the Palestinian, that's official syndicate, comes under the umbrella of the Palestinian Authority. And there is the journalist bloc, which is under Hamas, and now there is the Islamic Jihad bloc, and now there is the PFLP starting their own journalist umbrella. So the aim of all of this is really to look at something that unites all the Palestinian journalism under the umbrella of Palestinianism.
Okay, you want to come back to the... No? Oh, you're satisfied? Okay, thank you. Then we turn to the third external examiner, Professor Hans Beentjes from the University of Amsterdam, to continue the exchange of ideas.
Thank you. Dear candidate, I want to compliment you on your study. I really liked the multifaceted character. You know, you do a discussion, a review of the literature, you do a lot of reflection, but you also have empirical research. And I would like to ask a question about the empirical research, and especially about the content analysis that you did. What you did in this content analysis is you analyzed 2 cultural programs and 2 children's programs, and you analyzed especially the themes and values in these programs. And you take these themes and values as an indicator of maybe say the media production and the thinking behind the media production, and in part you base your conclusions about the factionalism on the content of these programs. In my view, and I think in your view as well, it's very important that you choose programs that are somehow representative for the broadcaster you want to write about, what you want to talk about. And what I would like to ask you is whether you can substantiate, perhaps more than you did in the dissertation, whether the programs that you chose are really representative of the broadcaster's choice. Because obviously, you know, if we all look at our own countries, we see sometimes programs that are more or less special, unusual, and you know, it shouldn't be. If you want to make assertions about a broadcaster, you shouldn't have these programs, but you should have, you know, the regular programs that are really representative of the broadcaster. So I would like you to reflect on that, and so that's the main question. And what I would also like is if you could say some more about the choice of Sesame Street, because I'm involved in a Sesame Street in the Netherlands, and that may actually be the reason why I'm here. And what we know is that the American producers of Sesame Street Workshop, likes to have a say in how Sesame Street is produced in other countries. And that say is substantial. So if we are talking about a representative program for a broadcaster in any country, but also in the countries that are discussed, in the country that is discussed in this dissertation, then it seems an odd choice to take Sesame Street, because there is a lot of influence You could call it American influence, but I think you should call it the influence of Sesame Street Workshop. So in your reflection on representative, I would like you to explain why you took Sesame Street and in what sense you think that's a good choice. Thank you.
Highly learned opponent. Now I see your question is regarding the selection of programs. Well, we started actually this process by, it was almost 9 months of landing to the right programs, and there has been some thorough discussions with the different scholars that are operating within the Palestinian context as well as the wider Middle Eastern context. What we have tried to do is to look for the most prominent TV stations that are factional, and those are the most prominent anyways, whether they are factional or not, they are the most prominent and leading ones. That's the ASC and PSC. So by selecting them, we have narrowed down already a selection. So then we look at what type of programs they offer. Then we look at all the issues that came across all the programs. We put them on a screen and start to discuss the aim of each of them individually. Then I ran into the producers and the owner of the idea of this program to understand where is this idea coming from. So focusing on the children, we found the most common that is not hit by defactionalized content. That was an argument which was made by one of the producers, which I would like to explore further, and that included the Sesame Street. So the selection basically is based on taking the 2 programs that are children, and one of the ones that came, which was very controversial in the United States of America, was the Pioneers of Tomorrow. And if we all remember, in 2008, 2009, Al-Aqsa satellite TV channel was bombed by the Israeli F-16s because of this. And there was this other issue of all Middle Eastern media starting to question, where is the Muppet? Where is Nasur? Where is Nasur? Nasur is the little puppet on the show, and Nasur did not appear. So there were phone calls from all over the Middle East. Children were calling, what happened to Nasur in Gaza? We don't see him on the show. And then suddenly the next day, the other Muppet comes and says, I am Farfur, I'm the brother of Nasur. Nasur died. And then they ask him, how come? They say the Israeli interrogators killed him. That created a big outcry. The United States protested this, and I know that Disneyland also protested and went to court for legal rights because Hamas or the ASC used some of materials without permission or copyright. So there is a need to study this program, obviously. That's why I really had to focus on this and to be selected. And also it has been all the time shown as Hamas narrative. We want to see what this show is all about, really. So we try to see what's the other program that is next to it or facing it in the Palestinian TV, where the only program that we found is Sesame Street. And that takes me to your second question. Yes, Sesame Street Workshop. I have been, as part of my first year of this study, going to Columbia University in New York. I have been able to meet with the Sesame Street Workshop, the global workshop in New York. And indeed, we do see the Americanism or Americanization of content and production of Sesame Street, as you rightly said. But there were also some Palestinian hands in all of this. After all, the Palestinian narrative is written by Dr. Dawood Kuttab, who is based in the West Bank, and the Palestinian team, which claims to be all Palestinian narrative. They have demonstrated this quite clearly to me in the selection of colors, in the selection of everything. And they have denied that there were any interventions by Sesame Street. I did not accept this denial. As an academic and a scholar, I find it very problematic that I accept this, because I know from the different sources and also the guidelines of the Sesame Street Workshop globally that they have to give a consent when it comes to the research and when it comes to agreeing with what the content and procedures are. But there has been indeed Palestinians. When you see Palestinian Sesame Street, you see people in the fields, you see children going to some elite schools, Christian schools, whether in Bethlehem or Ramallah or Jerusalem. You could also see children in a couple of occasions in Gaza. You would see Palestinian flags. That's something which was common, and that's something where I found there is a lot of comparison and a lot to say, together with Pioneers of Tomorrow, which is produced by ASC, and Sesame Street, which is produced by PSC. So that's really how the selection started, and particularly Sesame Street, because I found indeed it was a debate which I got into with myself for at least 6 months. Is this Sesame Street representative? Is it really fair to take Sesame Street? Isn't this more of an American show than? But I have found that no, it is representative. And after all, that's what the Palestinian children are consuming in the TV. That's what they're watching.
Yeah, you're okay with the answer? Okay, good. Then we turn to the fourth external examiner, Professor Mark Doze from the University of Amsterdam, to continue the exchange of ideas.
Thank you. Dear candidates, I join my colleagues in complimenting you on an amazing piece of work, a fascinating piece of work. I also want to thank my colleagues here for the privilege of being in this esteemed cortege. It's an honor for me to be here and to be able to engage in a conversation with you about your work. Now, I come to this work from the perspective of media studies, which is my field. And you've been very, very kind to cite me in your work and using me to say, well, you know, we don't just live with media anymore, we live in media. We use media in all kinds of different ways to make sense of ourselves and the world we live in. And that goes way beyond watching a television show. And I think, obviously, I think you're very right to make that point. Now, in that context, I do see a bit of a tension, or I feel a bit of a tension in your work, because you describe in your book a polarized or factionalized media culture, right? In the Palestinian environment. Then you take your empirical material and you say, hey, this is interesting. There's a sort of a defactionalization process going on at the same time within the specific context of children's and cultural programs. And then all of that takes place with an audience and also a producer culture that consists of, you call it a new Palestinianism, right? That's how that audience is addressed. That's how that audience sees and makes itself in this media. There's an interesting tension between polarization, defactionalization, fragmentation. I mean, it's highly complicated and therefore very interesting. So my take on this as a media scholar would be, well, media tend to work in an interesting way in the sense that they don't like, and with they, I mean both the people who make media, the kind of content that gets produced and the way we consume media. We like to recognize ourselves in media. We like, and we don't really like too much fragmentation and difference and dissent. I mean, it's like we want to see a more or less coherent picture that we can relate to. If media truly would mirror real life, nobody would be able to make sense of it because real life is very complicated. So what I see in your conclusions about the kind of worldview that is produced in these shows is a worldview that's too seamless and too perfect. It's like there's a coherent sense of Palestinianism present in or being a Muslim as well in these programs that doesn't relate not just to real life but also to what we know about what the essence of Palestinian identity is to some extent, which is its fragmentation, right? I mean, to be Palestinian in Gaza or the West Bank, the people who stayed in Israel, the people who migrated, the refugees in Lebanon or the Palestinians in the Gulf countries, these are not the same Palestinians, right? So through satellite TV, they're all drawn in to these shows and to these contents, but the contents like reduce all that fragmentation to a more or less coherent sense of being Palestinian. So my question to you is, could you not conclude, at least additionally to your conclusion, not just that these programs are an example of a defactionalized media culture, but also perhaps examples of a more global media culture that tends to overlook, bypass, ignore, or even repair the inherent differences and complexities of people's lives and identities. So, in short, do you see your work also fitting in within a broader paradigm of media studies and what media do to us as we use them?
Highly learned opponent. Very good question. Thank you so much. I have been indeed looking at what is beyond defactionalization, and I see that this is exactly your question, beyond defactionalization, and how do we fit this into the global context of media and media production and media consumption. It is quite difficult to think of that in a Gaza and West Bank context. Why? Because Gaza is under blockade. That's a fact which no one can ignore. Israel acknowledged that. Gaza is living under a situation where you deal constantly with the same issues, basically. I have seen a lot of repetitive content, messages, and repetitive ideas that came throughout the themes when there's discussion about nationalism. There are things that I have seen 20 times already in the same show, talking about the love for land, the right of return, and then again the right of return, that we have to return. So there are some core issues that really guide the Palestinian media. And the Palestinian, in my view, the Palestinians are stuck with all these ideas around Jerusalem, the right to return, the love for land, homeland, and then the issue of refugees, and then the issue of nationalism and national agenda and resistance. These issues that are considered to be a national line, which really put the Palestinian study at a roadblock, if I may say so. A roadblock that you really can't go further. But what is interesting that some study like this can be used exactly in other Middle Eastern studies, particularly after the so-called Arab Spring. I'm talking about Libya here, I'm talking about Tunis, I'm talking about Egypt, I'm talking about Yemen. In Libya, for example, there are 19 TV channels. When you go through the remote control, there are 19 TV channels. I would say 90% of them are factional. Now, the Palestinian case is unique because we're talking about a case of Palestinian media that used to be before factional for a long time, but factionalism is nowadays, for all these post-conflict or post so-called Arab Spring, is a quite new and modern idea. So there are now more ways to look for what they call reconciliation between the Palestinian factions. And both Fatah and Hamas seem to be agreeing with the findings of this research, that nowadays they even brag about this, that, oh, well, we did indeed defactionalize when it comes to children and culture, because that's the only thing that unites us. Children, we want to teach them no factionalism. Well, that comes quite clearly. But also culture, there is something that unites us, after all, whether it's the Islamic or secular flavor. After all, it's uniting us. So I would, to go back to your question, yes, I do see that, well, first, it's very difficult to go beyond this in the Palestinian context and to connect it, because Gaza and the West Bank are so isolated. It's particularly Gaza with the blockade imposed and the difficulty of movement as well of academics and scholars. But a study like this should be useful in terms of applying it also in other contexts in the Middle East, as I have said, in different Arab countries. I have been in conferences and seminars engaging with different Arab scholars, and this is something that we started to find is emerging, really, that people who are tired of factionalization, big parties, they want to look for shows that simply discuss spirituality or religion, or they want to be discussing entertainment, or they want to put on songs for the children. They just don't want to look for issues that make them go back to what they are. And again, it's very difficult for Palestinian producers to avoid what they are living in. You know, after all, they're living in Gaza. We cannot be expecting them to be discussing issues related to Japan or New York, or as pretending if they are living in Geneva, Paris, or Amsterdam. That's not possible. They are living in a context there. It's a form of resistance, and they want to look for what unites them, and that's exactly what Palestinianism is all about.
Yes, of course, you can return to the answer.
Just thank you for a wonderful answer, very informative. Just one brief follow-up. Do you think this tiredness of this factionalized content, often embodied by, with all due respect, men shouting at each other, could that be part of the explanation of what you write in your thesis as the rather remarkable inclusion, or the beginning of an inclusion of minority voices, specifically women, in these kind of programs?
Well, my honest view, not always the producers have been able to control this. So in my view, it came against their wish, really, particularly in more of Islamic TV stations where women are involved, and the children and some artists. So this message that comes across, for instance, in the issue of cultural flashes, when they bring some a guest who's speaking, an artist or a poet who had education for the last 10 years in Paris, and he's coming with totally different knowledge. He is contributing entirely different knowledge that is totally different from what's happening in the ground. He's coming to be discussing French art, he's coming to discuss French museums, and then there are some people who went to Germany to do their education, and they are invited in the show, so they're coming to bring in new ideas that are not necessarily factional, that talks about something that unites everybody. That's something that you see also in television, whether in the Netherlands, the US, or France. So these kinds of contributions from people have indeed contributed to the case of defactionalization. Again, it may not be the wish of all those producers, but it's present. When you bring those people in the show, then that's what they talk about, because they have been simply focused on this issue. When you bring somebody who lived throughout the years in Sweden and how he looks at the Gaza war in 2008, 2009, then he starts to reflect through poetry of how much he loved home, whether his mom is still alive or not alive, and then he writes the poetry from afar, and then that's what the ASC called the literature of resistance, and how this same literature of resistance in the ASC is used and seen by the PSC. Totally different ways, but after all, both of them are talking about liberation, both of them are talking about new ways of ending the occupation. They are different, but after all, if you look at it through the eye of content analysis, both of them want to be free.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, then I turn to the internal examiner, Professor Mohammed Salih, and I would like to request you, with a view to the clock, to ask a relatively brief question.
Okay. Thank you very much, Mr. Rector Magnificus. Dear candidate, I would like also to join my colleagues and appreciate your work. I commend you for a very solid piece of work, fascinating. My question to you comes from the idea of defactionalization in relation to two areas, that is children and culture in Palestine. You take this as a puzzle, but in fact it is not a puzzle. If you go to Colombia, I think Colombianism exists. If you go to the Basque or to anywhere, that liberation movements, no matter how they are contesting the government, it is ideology, it is political programs. Still, when it comes to children and culture, I think Palestinianism, Colombianism, or Tamilism, where all of these struggles are taking place, is not a puzzle. I think, to me, the puzzle would have been if they were actually factionalized, not the opposite. If they are factionalized in the domain of children and culture, then I think that would be a real puzzle. But for you, your puzzle to me is not a puzzle. How do you explain it? Because I don't find the idea of factionalism, particularly when you contrast it with partisanship. And of course, factionalism, it can be three things. It can be cooperative, can be degenerative, and can be competitive. And in fact, all of them can be embodied within the function, because a faction does not exist by its own. A faction is an offshoot of a political party, liberation movement, social movement, whatever it is, that is a faction. It does not exist by itself. So I would like you to reflect on those two. I feel that there is a tension there. Tell us, first of all, why do you find it a puzzle that is, the Palestinians are defactionalized in the area of culture and children? And number two, how can a function stand stand by itself outside another political institution, a party, a liberation movement, whatever it is. So, and how is it related to the Palestinian? Or is there a Palestinian exceptionalism? And if there is, then what are the prerequisites of that exceptionalism?
Yep. Well, highly learned opponent, thank you so much. Indeed, I will address this question by going back to page number 76, 77 in my thesis, where I have discussed this thoroughly. It was indeed one of the issues which came across, but it comes often much more stronger from European scholars than American scholars. More recent work on faction by Book helps to make the point that factions have been defined in many different ways over time in different contexts. The definition of a faction in the Palestinian media context as used in this study comes closest to the definition of earlier thinkers like Hume, Burke, and Key, for whom factions are political machines serving mostly personal interests. Taking into account these various elements of a definition of this study, factional media will be defined as the situation where a group based around personal ambitions and ideological goals. So that definition has to be kept into mind. And these goals usually to conceptualize its audience as a group and individual who approve of one of the political faction's dominant positions. B is overt in its privileges of narrowing and even individual faction interest over the wider interest of the general public, and that includes economic, social, political interest. C is found primarily by competing political as opposed to corporate or governmental sources, and D verifies competing factions and means to gain support of its own leadership position, which we have seen. It comes quite across. Both Hamas and Fatah media, they are unwilling, even under the umbrella of defactionalization, to give away the position of leadership. I have used a Gramsci understanding, and the Gramsci understanding was used in this context only for using the word hegemony in order to maintain the status quo by compromising on some principles and some issues in order to maintain their standing and to keep their political standing on the same floor, basically, without giving too much compromises. But compromises do happen, that's acknowledged. So among the scholars working on faction within parties, few would use the specific definition, which is tailored to the particular context of media in Palestine. Factionalism is recognized by its distinctive features, if I may say so, in which the press and other media as actors are seeking to narrowly control public opinion, to shore up support for an individual and his action or her action, while it's attacking the integrity of the competing factions or factions. That we have seen, but we also go back to the trend of culture and children shows where these factionalism did not occur, and that was intentional. It was unlike many of the other TV outlets, which still continues, and we have seen this. I have seen this at least in a couple of Arab TV stations, the discussion of children shows where children are used actually to attack the other party. And we have seen it in the Palestinian context. I have seen some of the shows right after the internal fighting in 2007, June 2007, between Hamas and Fatah, where children were using slangs, and they were used in the shows to hit the other ones and to name and shame. But that disappeared because it seems that both of them, whether this is the result of talks in Doha or in Mecca or in Cairo, we're not sure, but we have seen the intention to defactionalize. I go also into the issue of the differentiation between partisan. I have discussed in page 79 and 81, tried to distinction between partisan and factionalization, and in my argument I say that factionalization or faction, it is what is recognized in the Palestinian context, because we have never seen any situation where Palestinians were called Palestinian parties, but in fact they were Palestinian factions that they were referred to in most the global literature, not only media but also political science.
Okay, thank you. I suggest that we turn to the final opponent, which is the promoter, Professor Dick Dowers from the Erasmus School of History, Culture and Communication. Please.
Dear candidate, Azizi Mohammed, I'm very happy that you're standing there, and I think a little bit of the pride go to my neighbors here for having supported you in producing this. I think many of us, it's beyond our imagination how difficult it sometimes was actually to work on a thesis like this in conditions in Gaza. So very well done. It's also a good read. You're a journalist, of course, and that makes reading it slightly more fluent than some of the other theses I've read in the recent past. You're also a media worker, and I want to get back to that fact, the fact that you're both a media worker and a scholar. And of course, I'm an historian, so I will ask a question about the history, the pro-history of the new Palestinianism, the emergence of the old Palestinianism. And that concerns basically the mandate period, the 1920s, 1930s, and the early 40s. In your chapter 2, you give a impressive list of publications, printed media, which were printed in Palestine. And my question is, to what extent do these compare to other types of media, traditional media, communication? And my question is, do you not overrate the impact of print media in this period on the development of Palestinian national identity feelings and the cultural Palestinian proliferation? Because many of these publications would be irregular. I know from my research in Syria they were sometimes handwritten. Circulation would be limited. Whereas, for instance, Friday sermons, political rallies, word to mouth, perhaps even radio, may have had a greater impact. So I would like to have your reflection on the fact that we have sometimes a tendency, perhaps even if you work in media, to overrate the impact of media also in present conditions.
Highly learned promoter. Thank you so much for this very useful question indeed. I think your critique, that might be the case. However, in the situation of Palestinian media, as we know historically, most of these documents and papers, even since the British mandate, are gone, really. Some of them are available often in some archives, either in London or in other places, but Palestinians don't have them, simply. So I would say out of the 90 chapters that I have written, the history chapter of the short history of media in Palestine, the reception and the perspectives, it has taken me over a year to write this chapter on its own, simply because it was too difficult to get the materials and to get access to materials, whether to go to Amman, Jordan, or to go to London to look for people who have the materials, or to look for some books that have been burned in Jerusalem and in Ramallah. In Gaza, certainly there wasn't any historical records. There might be some I try to value all these records, but what I try to do throughout this chapter is to look also for what it was to do defactionalization and if there were Palestinianism present back then. It wasn't easy to see because I did not do content analysis. If I want to do content analysis on this particular period, then that's an entirely different PhD, which I wasn't really quite keen to get into. But I have discussed the background of media under the British mandate from 1920 to 1948, and then I went to discuss the factions without factionalism, and by that to discuss the factions itself without factionalism. So to look at Palestinianism, was it really present back then or not? And why it did so is because of lack of literature on the Palestinian media. This period, at least in the Palestinian context, or in the Arab context, I have not seen in Google Scholar in Arabic or anywhere in the Gulf any historical record that puts the Palestinian context of media in a full. I don't think that I have done this in any very fair way, unfortunately, but I have done what I try to do is to do a very small and short analysis of this period by also looking at women's voices, because I want to try to compare women's voices back then and then.
You may finish your sentence.
I was trying to look at the women's voices back then. I also was trying to look at the elite competition, which we find nowadays. It's transferred from elite competition back in the 1940s to nowadays political competition. So, and factionalism and the Arab Revolt, I was also trying to look at the Palestinian journalism beyond Nakba to see some form of comparison. We are talking about the media that I've studied in this study was in 2009 and 2010. Right after the Gaza war, but there was also looking at the media right after the Nakba. What are the comparisons here? I'm not trying to compare here, and I'm not implying that I'm trying to do any comparative study of this, but to get a sense of understanding, has there been any elites voices or normal voices, or has been any voices of women or children or not? Thank you.
Well, that must have been one of the longest sentences this morning. But Mr. Mohammed Almoghayer, the time allotted for the defense of your thesis has elapsed, and the committee will now withdraw to consider it. I ask you to remain here until we return. I adjourn the meeting of the committee so that it may consult upon the matter. I hereby reopen the meeting. Mr. Mohammed Almoghayer, the full doctoral committee has taken note of your thesis. Having heard your defense of it, and having considered the scope and content of your research, I'm able to award you the title of doctor. Professor Karen Arts is authorized to confer the degree upon you in the customary manner.
It is with great pleasure that I undertake the task which the chair of the full doctoral committee has allotted me. On behalf of Erasmus University Rotterdam, and particularly the International Institute of Social Studies, I confer upon you the PhD degree. As proof hereof, I present you, in a moment, with this certificate, duly signed by the members of the full doctoral committee established by the ISS, and endorsed with the seal of Erasmus University Rotterdam. Allow me to take this opportunity to be the first to greet you as a doctor and to congratulate you on your achievement. I now hand the floor to Helen Hintjes, who on behalf of the supervisory team will deliver the laudatio.
This is for Dutch people. To sit down. Yeah, you can. Can you sit down? No, he has to stand in front of me. Okay, Mohammed, it seems I'm addressing you from very close quarters. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to do a very short laudatio. If I take more than 5 minutes, just start fidgeting. It is a play in 3 acts on the joys of remote supervision. Act 1. Google Docland. I guess there's a connection problem. Mohammed? Hi there, good to see you here. Did you share chapter 3 with me in Google Drive? Okay, I see it now, we're in business. Go to the file in Google Docs. Oh, alhamdulillah. So, did you get the invite to the document? I'm inside chapter 3, smile. Yes, I got the invite. It says it's not reachable in my region, i.e. I can't access it from Palestine. Oh yes, virtual apartheid. Now I'm connecting another way as VBN, which is a Dutch network, to avoid Israeli control. I need my password for the library. My cousins know how to make it hell. Okay, take your time. Okay, now it works. I'm connected as computer in NL and not in Palestine. Cool, wallahi. Okay, so what are the main issues with this chapter? Well, I'm not happy with this chapter. By the way, this is 2014. I'm not happy with this chapter. I worked on it. Still, I don't know what else to do to improve it. So what do you want this chapter to do in the thesis? What's the aim? To prepare the reader about the media environment in general and constraints that journalists face. Okay, let's work in the doc. I'm on the next page, Mohammed. Are you there? Hello? Are you there? Is it a bad time? Oh, I'm still working, doing the research and looking for references to address points you raised. Shall we? It's slow, I know, but a good learning process. The one controlling internet kicked me out of this document 8 times already this evening. Act 2, Judith Butler and the F-16s, 9th April 2015. Hi there, Mohammed. I've started looking at the chapter. Hi, Helen. Yes, I'm here. Do you know Judith Butler? Yes, Judith Butler is someone huge in feminist studies. Oh, is she? Yes, Dubravka and Nachta use her work, for example, at ISS. Oh, she just blurbed my book, Shell Shocked. With a terrible, unnecessary exactitude. Mohammed Almoghaier's War Chronicle lets the world know the devastating losses borne by the Gaza people bombarded by Israeli forces in 2014. He himself suffered the losses he documents, opening up the question of how one continues to write, to live, and to struggle for justice under such conditions. This book shows us how and why this struggle can and must happen, giving us details of destruction we need to know about, to awaken the world into a lucid understanding of the degradation undergone by a population that seeks to live, to mourn, and to resist. In this text, the witness of suffering, the one who suffers, and the activist are one, offering a searing case for why the assault on Palestinian people must end and why we must all struggle for the end to violence. Judith Butler, University of California, Berkeley. 26th May 2015. Hi, Helen. How are you doing? Yesterday was not good. We were being bombed last night anyway. What? F-16s are back again. They started bombing here as I was typing. They were bombing like rain. Oh, this never ends. Eventually, all three of you will have to get out and support the family some other way, or am I mistaken? Sweden, Norway, Netherlands? Nope, nowhere to go. I have family here. I know you've said it before. I just keep wishing the world was not as it was. Don't want to leave them because we have a passport. Loyalty does mean something in Gaza then. Listen, let's do the painful review of chapter 3 tonight. Yes, we should do that now, if you can get online without F-16s. Internet is on and off here, scary, neither peace nor war, but also dark. Oh, neither peace nor war, only dark. That could be another book title, Mohammed. Good night, wish you all well, thank you. Okay. That's the joys of remote supervision. Now the laudatio. It's good to see you here. I would like to commend you, Mohammed Almoghayer, for your fortitude with your studies, as with your journalism. Your moments of despair were pretty short-lived, confined to when Gaza was actually being bombed, whether you were injured or sick, or the thesis when it seemed endless. And in spite of your history of being detained, tortured, intimidated, and more recently repeatedly denied exit permits, you often wanted to work more than I was willing to. At other times, it was me who cajoled you, reminded you that the PhD would indeed one day be finished. With the whole team of promoters firmly behind you, we all knew that finally you would do it. Personally, I will never forget when Google Documents suddenly went pink. That sign that somewhere nearby, near you, a bomb had dropped on Gaza. This happened during the war of 2014 and regularly ever since. Before studying for your master's and then doctorate at ISS, you were already well known from a young age for your street-level journalism in Gaza, focused on daily lives and direct contacts with ordinary people. You won several prizes, including the Martha Gellhorn Prize, presented to you by John Pilger, and an award for Best Youth of 2006 from the New American Media Organization. 10 years later, you're about to complete your doctoral studies. Well, you now have completed it. And of course, you've not done this study alone, as you would be the first to acknowledge. You're hosted by the School of Journalism at Columbia University, where you received inspirational advice. The Rabbani Foundation and Erasmus University Rotterdam both supported the cost of your studies, seeing obvious merit in your work. Others supported you in different ways, becoming part of your extended family, including Luke and Barbara de la Rive-Box, Jette and John Goulet, and Linda Johnson. The ISS rector, Professor Inge Hutter, and Minister Bert Koenders both did their best for you, and with Koenders I understand the assistance was mutual. Others I was asked to mention include Hans van Balen, Flip Schuler, Dries van Acht, Jan Weyenberg, and Heiko Jesayen, all in the Netherlands. John Snow from the UK, John Whitebeck in France, they also deserve a mention and thanks. Finally, Noam Chomsky and Richard Falk have also been among your moral supporters, for instance, when you gave evidence with Falk in person to the Russell Tribunal on Palestine in 2014. Today, we narrowly avoided a PhD defense by Skype. You and your family seem to be counted among the most precious possessions of the Israeli government, since they almost refused to let you go at all. So little do they want to lose you. In any case, after this, we wish you every success, some peace and quiet with Lena and Omar, and we also hope the rest of the family may someday join in this peace and quiet. Your dedicated sumud, resistance, is impressive to see, and for the sake of your cousins, I hope you long continue with professional journalism, not least because so long as you do continue with this work, the hopes of Gaza people will continue to be your focus. I also hope that you'll take your research further and maybe manage to take on board some of the comments that were made during your excellent defense. I think it was excellent in terms of both questions and in terms of how you performed. Thanks very much. That's it. Bye.
Dr. Mohammed Almoghayer. Let me deviate a little bit from the protocol to say that we were very pleased to see you here this morning. Until, I think, late Tuesday night, we were uncertain whether you could be here or not. And as explained already by Helen Hinchins, it was the intervention by others who brought you here. But now it's my pleasant duty, on my own account and on behalf of the Institute and Erasmus University Rotterdam, to congratulate you on having obtained the degree of doctor. This concludes the present ceremony, and I hereby declare the meeting closed and invite you all to the reception which is at the other side of the church. Thank you very much.